I invite you to join with me in Luke chapter 15, beginning at verse 11. Luke chapter 15, beginning at verse 11 through 24. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to him his livelihood. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed into a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in that land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will rise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servants, bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry.
I think I was driving around the city of Indianapolis when I got my first hint of trouble. I was on the road, headed to a gospel meeting, and my phone rang. There was a young man on the other end of the line, a young man that I know. He said, you got a minute? I have a question. I want to talk to you about it. Just a little bit of background. Months before, this young man had been working with a church, training to preach the gospel, and he had made a decision that he would actually leave that training program because he wanted to go back and finish his education. And so that had happened several months before. Time had gone by, and now I'm getting this phone call. And he said, now don't freak out. Don't you hate when they start with that question? He said, I want to ask you about alcohol, but I don't want to drink. I'm not drinking. I just was out with some friends, and the question came up, and they said some things that I didn't know how to answer, and I want to talk to you about that. So I said, okay, I'm just in the car. I got some time. So we drove along for a while, and he talked to me about his questions, and I gave him some answers, and we went back and forth, and the call ended, and I hung up. He seemed satisfied, but I wasn't. You ever have one of those conversations that when it's over, you just think, I'm not getting the whole story here. Something isn't right. And it wasn't. In the months that followed, there were more phone calls and more questions, and the questions took us deeper and deeper and became more and more basic and profound. Ultimately, we were talking about, can we be sure that the Bible is the Word of God? And at points, can we be sure there is a God? In an astonishingly brief period of time, this young man training to preach the gospel was on the verge of losing his faith. It is not an unfamiliar story, brothers and sisters. In fact, I am sad to say to you today that it is epidemic among our brothers and sisters, our church family, young people losing their faith. You've heard stories like these. There are lots of stories that go a lot like the one I just described to you. This story's different. Because this isn't just another random kid out there who lost his faith. This was my kid, my son. Well, the last couple of years, I've opened up a little bit in my preaching and began to talk some about this journey that Heidi and I are making with Todd. And I have to tell you that as I have done that and preached in a few places, it is though someone has thrown open these floodgates in the response that has come back just from that little bit of sharing. I will go someplace and I will talk about this, and when I am finished, there will be a half dozen people waiting in the back who want to talk, who want to share their story and their grief. And I will tell you this morning that I'm picking up on some things. First of all, I'm beginning to realize that there are a lot of people out there who share this road with us. I think far more than I have appreciated. In our church families, lots and lots of people struggling with and grieving over wayward children. And as I began to process that and think about that, I began to look over my preaching the last 30 years, and it's dawned on me that I haven't talked very much to that crowd. I mean, candidly, I don't know that I'd ever preached a sermon about it, and with the exception of a few pointed lessons dotted along the way, I don't know that I'd ever really tried to serve this large group of suffering people that are present in every church family. And then I thought about all the lessons I preached over the years, and you guys know this, all the lessons about raising kids, right? And how surely some of those lessons must have been like pouring salt in the wounds for these suffering moms and dads. I guess you can't avoid that to some degree. I guess it just would have been nice along the way to have also offered a little consolation. So I want to fill in some gaps this morning in my own preaching and address for you moms and dads who are trying to process their prodigal children. I have three hopes for this lesson today. First of all, I'm hoping the lesson will serve to sensitize all of us. I'm worried that there are others like me who just don't have a sense of how great the problem is and how deep the grief is. And so as a church family, I'd like to raise the level of our sensitivity to that crowd among us. Secondly, I'd like to try to offer some counsel and comfort to moms and dads who are making this journey with us. In the instance of transparency, I will tell you that most of what I'm going to share is not original with me. I had a friend a couple of years ago who learned about what Heidi and I were going through, and he sent me this wonderful email with all of this great counsel. So you just need to know I'm totally ripping him off today with a lesson, at least in a lot of it. And then the third thing I hope this lesson will accomplish is that it'll be equipping. As Wesley started out, and then David followed with the song, and then Jarvis included in his prayer, we are one family. And part of family involves bearing together the burdens. And so I hope I can say some things today that will help all of us to be equipped to share this load with our brothers and sisters who are suffering. Now, let me also apologize. I'm going to do something today that I never do, and that is I'm going to break this lesson into two parts. There's just too much to say. And frankly, on Ben's second to the last Sunday, I don't want to give him a chance to harangue me about how long I preach this morning, okay? Because if I tried to get it all in, it would be too much and too long, and I would rush, and I don't want to do that. So will you hang with me and let me move a little bit over to tonight too? The upside is that the lessons will be a little more brief because it is one lesson in two parts, okay? I want to talk to you about one thing this morning, and 3 things this evening, but I'm saving this one thing for today, this morning, because it's the longest and it is the toughest piece of all of this. So what would I say to parents who are struggling with prodigal children? The first thing I want to say to you is, it's not your fault. I know, that sounds so self-serving coming from a dad with a prodigal child. I thought a lot about that. So let me throw my friend under the bus. I actually didn't say that. That was the very first thing he wrote to me in his email. He said, it's not your fault. And then in parentheses, he said, and whatever you just said to disagree with me, it's still not your fault. He knows me too well. It is kind of the third rail for those of us processing prodigal children, those feelings of guilt and blame and responsibility. If you've had one, you know what I'm talking about. Those questions that go something like, where did I go wrong? What did I do? Or what did I fail to do that has now contributed to my child's spiritual collapse? What mistake in my parenting caused this? There are deeper questions behind that, or deeper issues behind that, that sense that if a child grows up and goes astray, it must and can only be the consequence of some kind of parental failure, right? It is an easy conclusion to which to jump. I know that I have about myself. And I'm embarrassed to say I've jumped to that conclusion about others too. Some would say, isn't that what the Bible says? Isn't that scriptural? Remember this passage from Max's sermon a couple of weeks ago on Sunday night? Doesn't Proverbs 22:6 in essence make that point when it says, train up a child in the way he should go, even when he is old, he will not depart from it, right? Isn't that verse saying that if I raise my kids to serve God, then when they are old, they will keep serving God, right? We've heard that argument our whole life. And then we begin to work it backwards. So, what happens if when he is old, he does depart from it? Keep working backwards, right? Well, then it must be because you messed up back there somewhere. You didn't train him right. And it has been that analysis of that passage that has become the source of unspeakable grief for lots and lots of parents struggling with wayward children. The problem is, folks, that I am not sure that the traditional way that this verse has been treated is necessarily doing justice to what the writer of Proverbs had in mind. Again, seems about self-serving for a guy with a wayward child. I know. Try to be independent of that and analyze the verse outside the emotional circle for a minute. A couple of problems I see with the way the verse has been traditionally treated. First of all, with this language, bring up a child in the way he should go. I think the typical view of that is, well, that means raise him to serve the Lord, right? You're looking at the verse up on the slide, right? You notice it doesn't say that. It says, train him up in the way he should go. And what I discovered that I didn't realize is that there are actually some other ways that language is understood. There are some who believe that what the writer of Proverbs is actually saying there is to bring up your children in a way that is fitting with their skills and ability. Raise them in the way they should go in life. For example, if your son, Dad, is a little more artsy than athletic, Dad, if he's a little more artsy than athletic, don't push him to play football because that's what you did. And because you think that's manly, more manly than being in the band? Come on, I was in the band too. Thank you, sister. If he's not good at math, don't push him to be an accountant because you were an accountant. You want a son to follow in your footsteps. That language could be saying, raise him in the way he should go, in a way that fits his talents, his abilities, his skill. Do you see that? Do you see that that's at least a possible way to understand the verse? So first of all, we've jumped to a conclusion, I think, about what the wise man may be saying. That may not be what he's saying at all, but let's assume that he is. Let's assume that is exactly what he has in mind, that he wants us to raise our children to serve the Lord, which is certainly what we ought to do. Well, you remember what Max said about this? In fact, when he was preaching about this, I was thinking, he is really stealing my thunder for a couple of Sundays from now. He reminded us that this is a proverb, it's a maxim. It speaks of things that are generally true, but not absolutely guaranteed in every case, right? Do you remember the example he gave? I like this. I hadn't thought about it. Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath. Does that work? Who said that? You said that? Wesley said sometimes. I can guarantee you, because I have been in the conversation, it does not work every time. I have talked slow and gentle to someone who got madder and louder. How about you? Is the proverb untrue? No, because a good bit of the time it does work out there. It's certainly going to be better to give a gentle answer. I thought about this one in Proverbs 10. Will you head over there? Proverbs 10, verse 27. I just want you to see that I'm not doing something funny with this passage because I'm a dad with a prodigal kid. In Proverbs 10, in verse 27, the wise man said, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be shortened. I will tell you, folks, I think that is generally true. If you live a righteous life, you will avoid some behaviors that could cut your life short. And candidly, if you live a wicked life, you could get involved in things like alcohol and drugs that may well cause you to live less, right? But I know this verse is not absolutely true. It's not a guarantee, because I'm going to tell you something. I know some wicked people that lived a long, long time. And I've known some good people who died too soon. Don't you? Train up a child in the way that he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Is that true? You raise your kids to serve the Lord, and it is likely that that is what they will do. But I hate to say this for you who are still involved in the process. It is not a guarantee for any of us, no matter how we raise our kids. And that's not what this verse is trying to do. I think we need to be careful and make sure we do with the passage what the Holy Spirit was trying to do with the passage. You check it out and do some research on your own if maybe you think I'm missing the mark. But I promise you this, for people sitting in this crowd with prodigal kids, I didn't do very much at this point to make you feel better, right? I don't think just clearing up Proverbs 22:6 magically makes all the guilt go away. I think we still wonder, what was it? What was my parental failure that has caused this spiritual collapse? And so let me say, if you're still there, I think the mistake you're making is you are trying to simplify the complicated. We're looking for just this one thing. And let me be clear, it's never that simple, folks. In fact, if we're going to stay busy trying to blame ourselves and figure out what our fault is in all of this, may I suggest that there's a lot that we need to think about, a lot of pieces of that need to be considered. Let me give you some to think about this morning. Number one, if I'm going to put the blame on myself, I guess I need to start by thinking about the influence I will have over my child, because it is tremendous. Will you go to Proverbs? Look at Proverbs 29. I'm headed to Proverbs 29. And I'm looking down at verse 15. I want to be sure that I'm not misunderstood on this point. I think parents exert enormous influence over their children. And so, Proverbs 29:15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. Do you see what the wise man is saying there? I think he establishes a linkage between parental failure and the outcome with that child. In fact, some of us have been living long enough, we've seen this verse in action. We could call the name of the kid. Don't do it. Don't gossip. But you know this kid, right? When he was little, mom and dad let him get away with everything, never held him accountable. And boy, when he got grown up, what a mess he was. And you could see how the two were connected, right? He was never made to behave. And when he was 25, he was really misbehaving with serious consequences, right? You've seen that. There's a connection between the parental failure and what went wrong with this child. And so, verse 17 of that same chapter says, correct your son, and he will give you comfort. He will also delight your soul. That's sort of like bringing him up in the way he will go. When he's old, he won't depart from him. Mom and dad will be happy about that. You see it? Or back up to chapter 19. Chapter 19 and verse 18. Discipline your son while there is hope, and do not desire his death. That's an interesting addition at the end of the verse, I think. Ephesians 6 and verse 4. Bring up your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Let me be clear. What mom and dad do really does matter. We have an impact on our children. I think we get this opportunity to help them identify what the right path is in life, and then to give them a little nudge to head them down that path. And so whatever else I say today, if you're sitting in this audience and you're busy raising your kids, you need to know that you're going to have a tremendous influence on them, okay? But that's not the only thing to think about. I think parents who blame themselves, that's all they consider. But there's more to the equation. Let me add this. We also need to appreciate that nobody's going to do this perfectly, right? In fact, it's always been a curious thing to me that God gives children, at least first children, to these people who have no experience raising kids. And if you don't think that's true, talk to a grandparent. We know about this, right? You with me, Pete? All right. And so we make mistakes along the way, just like our kids growing up blow it sometimes. Guess what? So do mom and dad, because we're new to this. We don't know how to do it. We're figuring it out along the way, right? And that's such a thorn in the side of parents with wayward children, because we're trying to figure out, well, what was the thing that I did that has now led to his collapse? You know what's interesting about that? Talk to the people in this crowd who have children who are all grown and all faithful now, and ask them, did you mess up? Are your kids faithful because you did the whole parenting thing perfect? I don't know of anybody who says that. Do you? Why? Because we all mess up along the way. Nobody's going to do this perfectly. And so that I can be thoroughly confusing today, let me add to this equation as well. Parenting and outcome don't always match up. Have y'all noticed that? Someone says, yeah, coming from a dad with a prodigal. I know, but it's still true. You've seen the family, haven't you? They had 4 children, and they were great parents, at least from what we could see on the outside. It looked like they were doing all the stuff that God tells you to do. And with 3 of those kids, it went just like you would expect. They were raised really well, and they got up, and they were grown adults living beautiful lives of faith and service, right? And you're wondering about the 4th kid. You've seen him. He was the rebel. Maybe even from his younger years, you could see it coming. The other ones were compliant, but he was dug in. He was resistant. Man, when he got out on his own, he went his own way. He rejected everything his mom and dad taught him, right? How does that happen? How do you raise a son who preaches the gospel and one who struggles to believe there's a God? You don't think I've wondered about that a lot? And it works the other way too. I've seen parents that, from what I could tell looking on the outside and looking at what God's word say, they weren't doing anything right. You've seen that parent too. Go, come on, you judge. You've been in the grocery store. And with most of their kids, it just turned out like you would expect. Their parenting was a mess, and when their kids got grown, they were messed up adults and replicated the cycle, except that one kid. I could call his name because I could see his face. Everything was wrong in the home he grew up in, but he is still serving God. Now tell me how that happens. It's in the Bible. I think about Josiah. Josiah had a terrible father and grandfather. And yet, he was faithful and served the Lord. And you want to know what really gets weird about that? Guess how his son turned out? Just like his grandfather and great-grandfather. He was terribly wicked. What are we trying to say? I'm trying to say that parenting and outcome, they don't always line up. And we know that's true. And then I would add this to the equation just so we thoroughly mix this up. You realize that other people are going to influence your kid too. You know that, right? I'm headed back over to Proverbs, this time chapter 1. Will you go there? Because he warns about that. In Proverbs 1, right at the very beginning of this book, Proverbs 1, down in verse 8, this is interesting. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. Pause. Did this kid get good teaching at home? Would you say he was trained up in the way that he should go? Well, then he won't depart, right? Well, that makes me wonder about verse 10, because verse 10 said, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Here's a kid who had a good mom and dad who were teaching him right. Their teaching was a graceful wreath to his neck and ornaments about his head. I think that means it's good teaching, and he needs to follow it and listen to it. But then he turns right around and says, but you better be careful that somebody doesn't influence you and lead you astray. What does that tell you? Even kids who are brought up right can hear the wrong voice and be led astray. Maybe a crowd of kids at school, maybe a college professor, maybe a spouse. And it's not just people. It's stuff that can happen. A spouse that is unfaithful to them, an unexpected tragic death. Folks, there are lots of things that can happen to us along this journey that threaten to upset the spiritual foundation and shake our faith. And we're going to have to decide. We're going to have to decide how we're going to respond to those things. It's not about one thing. Do you see that? Lots of things can contribute to the destabilizing of one's faith. And we have to decide when those things come how we will respond. Each of us must decide for ourselves how we will respond. Do you see it? I think that's what my friend meant when he said, this is not your fault. I don't think that had anything to do with my parenting. Not at all. I think he was focusing me on something different. I think what he was trying to say is at the end of the day, all of us make our choice about God. Listen, folks, I will not be able to go before God on the day of judgment and say, look, I would have served you, but I had some wicked friends in high school that led me astray. Or listen, I would have served you, but my spouse just didn't like the church thing, and I didn't want to have trouble in my marriage. And when Judgment Day rolls around and I'm standing before God, I will not be able to point over at my mom and dad and say, God, if they had just prayed with me more, I would have loved you more. If we'd had more home Bible studies as a family, I would have loved your word more. It's their fault. You see that? Nobody gets to do that. I make my choice about God. Why did Josiah turn out so righteous with such a wicked father and grandfather? The answer is in the text in 2 Chronicles chapter 34. 2 Chronicles 34 in verse 3, for in the 8th year of his reign, while he was still a youth, he began to seek the God of his father David. That's why he was a righteous man. He chose to serve the Lord, as do we all. And someone may say, but you don't understand. I know I failed as a parent. I can look back on my kids' growing up years. I was distracted by work. I wasn't devoted to the Lord like I should have been. I should have studied the Bible more with them. I should have been at their bedside praying at night. Maybe you look back and you see the parental failures, maybe some things that you think have hurt your kids. You know what you need to do with that? Own it. as a mistake, go to them and tell them, I really messed up in your growing up years. I should have been more devoted to the Lord. I should have set up an example. I should have done more of this stuff for you. And apologize. And then remember, at the end of the day, while we have an opportunity to take these precious souls and for a few years influence the choices they will make about God, while we have an opportunity to influence the choices they make about God, we do not make their choice. Everybody decides for themselves about God. I cannot go before God on Judgment Day and say, I didn't serve you because of my mom and dad. You believe that? I get that. And if I don't get to say that, neither does my son. Do you get that? Yeah, y'all weren't as quick on that one. It's a little tougher, isn't it? But at the end of the day, we all decide for ourselves about God. That's not your fault. Well, we're going to do some more tonight. Will you come back? I need to finish this. We need to stop for this morning and sing this invitation song. And I'm just going to remind you that we all make a choice about God. And it may be that there's somebody sitting in this crowd that needs to make a choice about God. Quit blaming other people for why you're not right with Him. It's not their fault. It's your fault. You decide. You choose. I decide about my relationship with God. So while we're saying that, how about you decide today? How about you decide that you're going to dedicate yourself to Him and serve Him, and so there won't be anybody to blame on Judgment Day, because He'll be saying to you, well done. Won't those be great words? We want Him to say those words to you, and maybe it will begin with the step you make right now to let Him have His way with you. If you need to respond, you make your way down to the front while we stand, while we sing.
Would you live for Jesus?